Hello, I'm Tim Hubbard and welcome to the Stratford-upon-Avon Literary Festival Goes Virtual, a series of conversations with authors that you can access anytime, any place and anywhere. Today, my guest is Damian Barr, who's currently celebrating the paperback publication of You Will Be Safe Here. This is obviously the hardback version, his debut novel, which was published last year in 2019 to glowing reviews. So, Damian Barr, welcome to Stratford-upon-Avon.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's lovely to be in Stratford, even virtually.
We should just say that you have a paperback copy of the book behind you, so this is not the copy that people will see.
That's the paperback there, which is very different from the hardback. The paperback features a scene from the second part of the novel, from the sort of more contemporary part of the novel, and the hardback is sort of much more typographic. And yes, I like them both. They're very different, but I like them both very much.
Well, let's move on then to You Will Be Safe Here. The novel spans just about 100 years, but rooted in one place, in South Africa, a location just outside Johannesburg there. And a much ignored part of British history and modern day atrocities. Let's start as the novel starts with the Second Boer War in 1901. Am I alone in not realizing the devastating influence of this war? What did you know of it before you began to write?
I don't think you are alone. I knew very little about the Boer Wars because we're not taught it at school in the way that we're taught about the First World War and the Second World War. It might be addressed as part of the scramble for Africa and that narrative of empire. And certainly if we are taught about it, we're taught that it was a sort of gentleman's war, and Rudyard Kipling was there, and Winston Churchill was there, and Mahatma Gandhi and Kipling, and so really it's not a part of our consciousness in the way that the First World War is and the Second World War is. If you think how many books and films and TV programs there are about the First and Second World War, acres. The Boer War is a tiny little bit on that shelf of history, and I think that the reason for that, well, there are two main ones. First of all, the First World War came along and swept all before it, I think, historically. But secondly, and more acutely, I think it's because it was a shameful conflict. At that time, Britain and the Empire descended on this tiny part of southern Africa, not yet a country called South Africa, but the Boer republics, and took up arms against these farmers who wanted and proclaimed their independence. And in doing so, brought upon them the shame of the world. We created a policy called scorched earth, which we can talk about, and we invented the concentration camps. And more women and children died in those camps, those British-run and created camps, than soldiers died on both sides of the war. So it really was a massive scandal at the time. In European newspapers, in the cartoons, the British bulldog was depicted ripping the throats out of children, starving women, with Cecil Rhodes, taking diamonds and gold in the background. So, it was a scandal internationally at the time, and I think that that's part of the reason why we don't want to remember it, and why we're reluctant to explore it in fiction, because we don't want to see what's there.
The novel begins with Sarah van der Walt and her son Fred being taken from their farm and to a concentration camp. Perhaps you could explain a little bit more about that term, concentration camp. This was the first time it had been used.
Yes, the first time it had been used in English. It had been used in Spanish before, the reconcentrados. It comes from a very simple fact. When you enact scorched earth, you burnt over 30,000 farms. The British ploughed salt into the soil so that nothing would grow there. They killed all the animals. They took what they could eat. They blew up the houses, and they created a homeless nation of women and children. And what they did with this homeless nation of women and children is they concentrated them into camps. And that's where we get the origin in English of the expression concentration camps. It's a concentration of people into an area. And crucially, it is a concentration of non-combatants. So these are not soldiers. This is not a prisoner of war camp. This is women and children and some men who just because of who they are, or maybe because of who their husband is and he's out fighting, they have been held in these places. Places which were calculatedly underfunded. The purpose of them was to create death on a scale that would break the morale of the men that the British were fighting, so that they would surrender and the war would be over quicker. That was the kind of rationale for it, and it's a rationale that Jacob Rees-Mogg repeated in Question Time last year when he said these camps were an example of British kindness and hospitality. He made them sound like Butlins, you know. But the fact is that they weren't. We knew what was happening. We knew week to week, month to month, much as we do with this current epidemic, who's dying, what they're dying of, where and when. You know, the government records this in these blue books. And I've read those blue books, and we knew exactly what was happening. And we knew it was happening because we were denying people soap, we were denying them water, we were starving them. You know, if you were a child, you got 1/16, I think it is, of a can of condensed milk a week to live on, 1/16. And if you refused to sign the Oath of Neutrality and swear your allegiance to Queen Victoria, your rations were halved. So the suffering was unimaginable, and there were 40 odd camps, and the suffering was unimaginable.
Yes, there were various attempts, though, weren't there, by people like Emily Hobhouse to
amazing Emily Hobhouse, yeah,
of the world to this plight by her work in Britain, and one of those visits is mentioned in the book here. Tell us a little more about Sarah and Fred's life in the camp.
Well, camp life was much more complicated and nuanced than we think of it. These women aren't simple victims. I want to show Sarah as the determined, educated, interesting woman that she was, and mother that she was, and wife that she was. She keeps a diary, which of course was forbidden by the English at that time, but she keeps a diary of what's happening, and the first part of the book is her diary. She records, you know, the rations. She records the fact that, you know, she'd lived on a farm in the isolation, and now she's sharing a tent with people, with her nearest neighbours, and there are people in the tent next door so close they can hear them breathing, coughing, crying. You know, so she has neighbours, really close neighbours for the first time. They all did, which means that there are friends. So Sarah makes friends with a woman called Helen, who she would never have been friends with otherwise, who's kind of, you know, beneath her socially, mucky bonnet, you know, that kind of thing. And she makes friends, and Fred also makes friends because there's a school. You know, these children never went to school in any real sense, and the camp had schools, it had choral societies, there were gardens, there was church, although they weren't allowed to pray or sing in their own language in case it was thought they were communicating secrets about the war or spies. So there was a sort of social life. There were shops in the camps, which I thought was extraordinary when I found that out. But the shops were also part of this cruel system. You could buy a gramophone, you could buy a bolt of silk, you could buy a book. But if you were what was called an undesirable, one of the women who wouldn't sign the Oath of Neutrality to Queen Victoria, you weren't allowed to buy food. You weren't allowed to buy fruit, milk, meat, any of the things that were also for sale in the camp. So it was very cruel, that you know, you had everything you needed to keep your child alive right there. You could see it, but you weren't allowed to buy it. So there was also a black market, and you know, did also have women doing whatever it was they needed to do to keep their children alive. So yeah.
Let's think a little bit about you, though, as author here. You mentioned Sarah's diary. Why did you choose that device to tell your story?
I love diaries. I don't keep a diary anymore. Like most, you know, when I was a teenager, I kept a diary. But I very much enjoy diaries, and I think that what I'm interested in with diaries is that people always write them with an idea that they're going to be shared or read. Sarah's writing it for her husband Samuel, who's away fighting on commando. That's another new term from this war, commando. And she's writing it for him because she wants to record what's going to happen. Now, she doesn't know that her life is going to be extraordinary. She doesn't know that you know, she's going to be taken to this place. She doesn't know what's going to happen. So she's just kind of, this is a way really for her to maintain contact with him, who she loves very much. and to tell him how much she misses him, and to keep him up to date with what's happening with Fred, and all of that. So, and it was partly inspired by the diaries and the letters that I read when I went to South Africa, and also by the accounts that were gathered. You mentioned Emily Hobhouse, this brave, intrepid British woman who went to South Africa and who recorded the accounts of what happened during scorched earth and the concentration camps, and in a brilliant book called War Without Glamour. Because she understood war mainly affects women, it mainly affects children. And she recorded those accounts because a lot of the women couldn't write, and actually they were really helpful to me. And so I thought, I don't want to be there observing. I want to be the person who is observing, if you like. I want to take us right into it. And the only way to really do that, I think, is first person. And I thought about letters, but actually the post was very unreliable then. Where would she be addressing them to? Where would Samuel be? And actually a letter is different from a diary, because you can't presume privacy even if privacy doesn't exist. It's not about the internal monologue, it's about an explicit conversation. And so I thought, no, a diary is the way to do this. And also the diary.
It's an incredibly personal way of involving the reader into the story. The graphic nature of your writing here really brings home the horror of those camps. Just staying with the camps themselves for a moment, we should just say that there were other camps for Black people here, weren't there, that Emily Hobhouse referred to, I think, in
yes, I mean, there were at least 40 white camps and at least as many Black camps. There were Black people in the white camps. Servants had been taken there, and family retainers and stuff like that. People who were treated as property. But the Black camps were even more dire than the white camps. We know very little about them, and there are very few accounts from people who were there. We don't even really know how many there were. And we assume that at least as many people died in those camps as died in the white camps. And the reason for that is that the British charged Black people for tents and for food. They gave them nothing for free. And the condition, when I say tent, you think of tent, like the bell tents in the concentration camps. These tents were often just like a scrap of cotton on a tree. They were squalid and horrific. And they said to these people, we're going to charge you for these things. But there was nowhere for them to work because all the farms had been destroyed. So what happened was that Black people were forced to work in the white concentration camps as guards and petty enforcers. And you have this situation then of almost biblical levels of hatred and resentment which are created between Black people and white people who, let's not be under any illusions, they weren't thought of as equal. There was no parity. Part of the reasons the Boers had moved inland in the first place was because slavery had been ended and they were unhappy about that. So it's not like this had been an Eden that the British interrupted, but there had been some, there wasn't the great hatred that then emerged. And Sarah says in her diary, we are brothers and sisters of the same soil. This is a sin that will not soon be forgiven. And of course, in short order, what you then eventually get is apartheid in South Africa. And I believe that part of the reason for that is the scars of what was done during the Boer War by the British. I'm ashamed to say.
That takes us forward there. Just a reminder before we move on to the second part of the novel, you're listening to Damian Barr here on Stratford upon Avon Literary Festival Goes Virtual. Damian, moving on to the second part of the novel, to a period with which many people will feel more familiar, that of political South Africa in the 60s, the 70s, the breakup of apartheid gradually, Mandela's move from prisoner to president. We meet now Willem, Irma's son, who doesn't fit in with his family. He has a huge fantasy life. He loves being on his own in the library. What's going on here? Introduce us to Willem.
Willem is the boy who we meet at the very start of the book, and then we flash back to Sarah for a long time, and then we meet Willem again. And really, Willem is a lot like me in many ways. I had that kind of fantasy life. I was a boy who didn't fit in. I was a boy who preferred books to football, and sometimes, playing with my pets to people. But he's a very sensitive boy. And there's a brilliant film that's just come out called Moffy, which is based on a book that I used to research for my novel. The film is set in South Africa, and it's really very good. And Willem is often called a Moffy, which is slang in Afrikaans for a queer or a poof or something like that. And it's a culture that Afrikaner culture is very macho, and the masculinity is very toxic, and that has terrible effects both for men and for women. And for a young boy who's questioning his sexuality, he's not sure if he's gay or not. He does know he doesn't fit in. And his best friend, really, apart from Brittany the pug, is his grandmother, is Raina. And I really wanted to show the relationship between grandparent and grandchild, because I think it's often neglected in fiction. And often we see in real life, I think, grandparents being able to show affection for their grandchildren, sometimes in a way that they can't necessarily show for their own children. And so I wanted to show that, and I wanted to show a generational span. So Raina's grandmother, Irma, is the daughter, and then there's Willem. And what we see over time is these people are born into different South Africas, really. Raina's born into a South Africa of apartheid, where white people are assured of money, comfort, safety, all of these things, entirely at the expense of people of colour. Irma is born into a world where that's in flux, where that's changing. And Willem is born on the day that Mandela is elected. He's born in an ambulance because they can't get through the traffic, because everybody's out there to vote. And he's born into a totally different South Africa. But of course, the old South Africas don't disappear. They build up in the way that history builds up. And they're all there to be confronted in some sense, and in a very literal way later on in the novel to be dug up. He's a boy who, like Sarah, whose life is transformed in ways that he can't imagine, and who is forced to fight for survival, and who is saved in the end by friendship, in the way that Sarah is too.
A significant event, both in the novel and in Willem's life, is his visit to the Bloemfontein Anglo-Boer Museum. I don't want to give away too much in terms of spoiling it, but what happens there? Why is that event? Can you explain why that event is so significant to him, anyway?
Well, I have to be very careful about spoilers. Yeah, exactly. It's a part of the novel which links the past and the present, and in obvious ways and in less obvious ways. It was a really significant moment for me when I went to the Anglo-Boer War Museum, because it is built on the site of Bloemfontein, which was the very first of those concentration camps. It's also where Emily Hobhouse's ashes are. So it's it's a place that vibrates with history and energy. And when I was there, I really felt all of that. And I used that experience. I gave that experience to Willem. What happens is that Willem encounters the past that we're familiar with as readers of the novel that he knows nothing about, and stuff is revealed, which is kind of quite devastating for the story. But for him, it's also a school trip. And he hates being stuck in the minibus with boys that bully him. And a really embarrassing thing happens to him on the way back on that trip, which means that he ends up being thrown out of school. Because he's a problem. Willem is a problem. He doesn't fit in. He refuses to behave, to be like other boys. He becomes, to me, he's a normal boy, but to everybody around him, he's not normal, and he's a problem that has to be managed.
Now, I'd like to come on to your research a little bit later in our chat, if I may, because the pace of the novel increases after his mother and her boyfriend decide to place Willem into the New Dawn Safari training camp. You will be safe here. Sarah was told, you will be safe here, when she goes to her camp. Now, again, we don't want to spoil the end of the novel. The first and the second part of the novel link up, but can you give us a hint of Willem's life from this point on, when Irma and Jan decide
Well,
this is the best place for him?
The camp that he's sent to is just south of Johannesburg, and it's a camp run by former soldiers, and they promise we will make men out of boys. And we'll talk more about my research in a minute, but that phrase is very chilling because it's a real expression that was used by real people against a real boy. But Willem is sent to this camp. Now, to begin with, having been bullied at school and having this reputation, he thinks, oh, it's a fresh start. You know, to start off with, there's other boys. All the other boys in this camp don't fit in for whatever reason. They're fat. They're goths. They're effeminate. They're whatever it is they are. They don't fit in. And he thinks, well, maybe this is a sort of chance for him. And he realizes quite quickly that, you know, wherever there are gangs of boys, a sort of pecking order will emerge, and his place is found for him in that new group. But he makes a friend there called Victor. In Afrikaans is Geldenhuis. That's as close as I can get to pronouncing it, Geldenhuis in the text. And Geldenhuis is much more certain about who he is, and he really likes Willem. He takes a shine to him, and so the two of them become friends. But life in the camp is really brutal. It's military exercise. It's constant, bizarre military exercises, brutal exercise. The boys are forced to fight each other. They're never given enough to eat. And the man who runs this place is called the General. And the General, believes in his dark heart that he's doing the right thing for these boys, toughening them up and getting them ready for a new South Africa. And that if he doesn't do it, somebody else is going to do it for them. So he's the man who runs it, and his lieutenant is a boy called Volker. And it's a sort of squalid, improvised boot camp, if you like, and that is where Willem is taken by his mum and stepfather. And as you say, the pace of the novel increases, and it's structured in a way that the first part is the longest, and each part of the book gets progressively shorter, so that physically it propels you to the end, as well as anything else. That was an idea I got from Constellations.
It really does propel you. It's a terrific read. I love this novel. Let's just come on to your research now, Damian, if we can. And you did visit South Africa, as you've intimated to us. That in a moment. But first, you saw a photograph of a boy in a newspaper here in the UK. So what was it about that story that led you in to his particular life?
Well, I mentioned a real boy in a real camp. The real boy is called Raymond Boys, spelled B-U-Y-S. And I've written a long article about this, which you can read in The Guardian. But Raymond Boys, I saw a photograph of him in, I think it was the Telegraph, and there are two pictures of him on the page. And first, he looks like a 15-year-old boy, blonde 15-year-old boy, with his arm around his mum at the gates of this camp, very awkward looking. And in the second picture, he looks like something from Belsen. You don't recognise him as the same boy. He has no hair. His joints are thicker than his bones. It's a very disturbing picture, very upsetting picture. And in fact, when his mother saw him in that hospital bed, she didn't recognise him. He'd been so tortured and injured and hurt in this terrible place by these terrible people. And when I saw that picture of that boy, the 15-year-old boy, before he went in there, he looked just like a boy I had gone to school with, a boy who had been my friend at school in Scotland, who'd come to my school from South Africa for a year and who'd gone back to South Africa, and who I'd lost touch with. But when I saw this picture, I thought, oh God, it's him. And I realised it can't be him, he'd be a man now. But it did look just like him, and that was my emotional connection, really. Was just, I thought, who is this boy? And then I read the story of, there was this argument, he was gay, it was a conversion therapy camp, he wasn't gay, but it was still homophobia. It was a very disturbing story, but I felt for the boy and I felt for his family, and I didn't think, I'm going to write a novel about this, or this is a good idea for the story. I just was interested in him and what had happened in the story. And then South Africa has a lot of violent crime, and the story just dropped out of the news completely. and I couldn't find any more about it. I'd started following the trial of the man who ran the camp, and I wanted to find out what happened for myself, really. And that was my way. That was my way into this whole thing. Was this picture of a boy. That's what led me to contemporary South Africa, and it was contemporary South Africa that led me to, the historical story, and to inventing Sarah, and to inventing Fred. Because to me, it's really obvious that, I think it was Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, and there is a great deal of echoing and rhyming between the past and the present in these stories, both literally in terms of the language that is used, you will be safe here, but also metaphorically, politically, emotionally.
South Africa, your research took you there eventually, to the gates, I think, or pretty close to the gates of...
Right outside the gates, yeah.
A camp such as this. Astonishing to think that these still exist. If you can, briefly tell us your own story of visiting.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go to the place where Raymond was last in the world, really. Where that picture of him with his mum was taken, I wanted to go. I had no thoughts beyond just wanting to go and see it, really. I just wanted to understand, well, where is this place and what's it like? And, to stand with my feet on the ground. And I was with a wonderful driver, researcher called Z, and he drove us to where the police had described the area was. We didn't have an exact address. And when we got to the area, people kept sending us in the wrong direction. And it became apparent that nobody wanted us to find this place. When we did eventually find it, it's very distinctive because it's got it's got on either side of the gate a fake elephant tusk, really big elephant tusk. And so I knew it was where it was. And when I got there, I felt hugely emotional being in that place where that boy had been, and he had no idea what was going to happen to him. And I pressed the buzzer because the man who run the camp, which was behind those gates, was in jail. And I thought, well, I wonder who's here now. And I pressed the buzzer and nothing happened, and I pressed the buzzer and nothing happened, and I pressed it, and again, a car came from the back of the property towards the front, and dusty, and there was dust coming up from the wheels, and there was loads of dogs barking, and there was just a wee suburban car, and two young guys got out dressed in khaki, and they proceeded to be very suspicious of me and why was I here. And I said, do you live here? And they said yes. And I said, do you know anything about what happened to the boys here? And they said, no, we don't know anything about those boys. And I said, okay. And they kept their hands out of view the whole time they were talking, and we've been talking for a while, and Z was pacing, and he shouted over to me, and I noticed that either side of the road, the narrow single track road that we'd driven in on, there were white trucks, one white truck either end of the road, approaching, called a bakkie in South Africa, like a pickup truck. And they arrived and they boxed our car in, and from each of the trucks got out absolutely massive guys, all with guns. And they were very calm and very, seemingly very friendly. And they said to, who are you? And I didn't tell them my name. I said I was here doing a story, and I asked them, did they know anything about the boys there? And they said, no, we don't know anything about those boys. And I asked them if they knew about the man who ran the camp, and they said yes, they did, and that he was in jail now, and in his prison cell he was painting the inside of his prison cell to look like the view from where we were standing. And they said, look, we'll tell you all about him, and all about what happened here, if you just get in the truck and come with us. And there was just no way, I was going to get in that truck. And the whole time they were talking, they were trying to get in between me and Z, who is black, and separate us physically. And the whole time we were talking, we were doing this strange dance to make sure that didn't happen. And I then explained that we had to leave. We had to go to Johannesburg. We were expected for drinks at 6 o'clock, and we would be missed. And maybe they could drive us back to the road, because I knew they would follow us anyway. So they did follow us back to the road, and we did drive back. And that moment really, that moment of irresponsibility was, I think, one of the moments that crystallized for me that this is now, these people are here now, these camps are still being run. Camps like this run all over the world, whether they're explicitly gay conversion therapy camps, or whether they are just places to contain boys who are perceived as problems. I felt a moral responsibility, and I thought, well, I have to do something about this. I have to do it. Nobody cares about these boys. And I felt the same way about the women and children in 1900. And nobody knows their voices.
Yes, of course. And You'll Be Safe Here is the result. An extraordinary moment for you, you say, outside the camp. And I think as you've been talking about the book, there have been extraordinary moments for people who've come to hear you speak about this, Damian. And I remember when we met first of all in Stratford at the literary festival then, a girl came up with an extraordinary story about her brother who'd been in a similar sort of camp. And I think that sort of connection has happened with audiences all over the place.
Yeah, you're right. That moment you described at Stratford, the other part of that story is that you might remember that young woman, her brother had been sent to a similar camp. Her grandfather had been interned during the Boer War, and she was researching her family history, and she just kind of couldn't believe that here was this book that spoke to the past and to the present. But yeah, I've had extraordinary moments touring with this novel where, I was just in South Africa. I got the last flight out of South Africa before it was shut down during Corona, and that was very powerful, taking the book back. And lots of people, they were like, well, why are you telling this story? You're British, dot, 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 it doesn't make you look good. And I said, because it has to be told. And there's much more awareness of it in South Africa than there is here. But it was very emotional taking it back there. And I had people, coming up to me and crying and taking my hands and saying, thank you. And, my grandmother was always terrified. She always hated the British, and she wouldn't shake their hand, she wouldn't talk to them, and your book will help people understand why. When I was in Australia touring with the novel, I had this woman stood up and asked a question, and this was extraordinary in Adelaide. Her father had fought in the Boer War. Her father had fought in the Boer War, and he was Australian. He always hated the English, and if the English were winning at cricket, he would turn over. I said, well, that's not that unusual in Australia. And she said, no, really, he hated the English. Even the Queen, he wouldn't have anything to do with her. And then when she got to 16, he told her why. He said he'd been sent to South Africa. He'd been told he was going to fight for Queen and country. He got there, he saw children starving behind barbed wire. He realised it was about gold and diamonds, and that was it. And, here was this woman I met, and like holding the hand of history. But, right up to the present, I was in New Zealand touring with the novel, and a man came up to me trembling, absolutely trembling, a man in his 40s. And he said, I left South Africa in the 1980s because I was called a mothie. I thought I would be killed. And he said, and your book, he said, broke my heart open, and it's given me a way back to loving my country, he said.
Well,
that's amazing.
It is an extraordinary book, and we're out of time for today. It is a phenomenal novel. You'll Be Safe Here, by our guest today, Damian Barr. Upsetting, captivating, enriching, sentence after sentence. I'm sure you'll love it too. The paperback and hardback, of course, are both out now. My thanks to Stratford Literary Festival goes virtual, and of course to Damian Barr. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.